War rarely announces its strangest moments. They do not arrive with orchestral scores or heroic framing. Most of the time, they unfold quietly, without witnesses, and vanish into the margins of official reports. Some are dismissed as errors. Others are ignored because they are too inconvenient to explain. On the morning of March 31, 1943, one of those moments began thousands of feet above the jungles of Burma, in a sky already saturated with violence. The China-Burma-India theater was never meant to be glamorous. It lacked the scale of Europe and the publicity of the Pacific Island campaigns, yet it was one of the most logistically brutal fronts of the Second World War. Aircraft flew long, isolated missions over hostile terrain where rescue was unlikely, and survival, if captured, was uncertain at best. Every flight carried the quiet understanding that no one was coming if something went wrong. That morning, a formation of American B-24 Liberator bombers pushed deep into enemy-controlled airspace. Their mission was routine by wartime standards: disrupt Japanese supply lines and air infrastructure supporting operations across Southeast Asia. The men aboard understood the risks, but familiarity bred a dangerous sense of normalcy. Missions blurred together. Procedures became automatic. Fear learned to hide. Second Lieutenant Owen Baggett was among them. Baggett was not a fighter pilot. He was part of a bomber crew, trained for altitude, formation discipline, and endurance rather than agility or dogfighting. His world was measured in engine temperatures, fuel flow, and the constant vibration of 4 radial engines struggling against gravity and enemy fire. Like most bomber crewmen, his survival depended less on individual skill and more on collective cohesion. That illusion shattered without warning. Japanese fighters intercepted the formation with precision. The B-24's size, once its strength, became a liability. Explosive rounds tore through the aircraft's structure, igniting fuel and shredding control surfaces. One engine failed. Then another. Fire spread rapidly, turning the interior into a furnace. Inside the aircraft, time collapsed. Training took over. There was no debate, no hesitation. Orders were shouted, but the roar of the engines and the chaos of impact made words almost meaningless. The only clarity came from instinct. The aircraft was lost. Baggett reached the exit and jumped. The parachute deployment was violent. The sudden deceleration wrenched his body upward as the canopy snapped open, transforming uncontrolled freefall into a slow, helpless descent. The bomber disappeared almost immediately, swallowed by cloud and smoke. Below him stretched miles of jungle, dense, unforgiving, and firmly under enemy control. For a brief moment, the sky was quiet. Then he saw movement. A Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 peeled away from the departing fighters and turned back toward him. Unlike the bomber, the Zero moved with elegance. It was light, responsive, almost predatory in the way it adjusted its position in the air. Baggett understood immediately what that meant. Parachutes offered no protection. International law regarding parachuting airmen was inconsistent, often ignored, and rarely enforced in the chaos of the Pacific War. Pilots on both sides knew this. A man descending under silk was not guaranteed mercy. He was exposed, slow, and utterly defenseless. Baggett had seconds to think. He checked his harness. His parachute was intact. His rifle was gone, lost during the escape. His only weapon was a standard-issue M1911.45 caliber pistol, a sidearm never intended to be used from a parachute against an aircraft at altitude. The Zero continued to close the distance. From the cockpit, the Japanese pilot would have seen an American hanging motionless beneath the canopy, a man already beaten by gravity, already defeated by circumstance. There was no urgency, no threat. Baggett made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He went completely limp. His body slackened, head dropped forward, arms hanging uselessly as if consciousness had already left him. From a distance, the illusion was convincing. Many airmen who had been hit during bailout did not survive the descent. A lifeless figure beneath a parachute was not uncommon. The Zero slowed further. It came closer than doctrine ever advised. In those final seconds, suspended between sky and jungle, Owen Baggett waited. Not for rescue, not for mercy, for a mistake. To understand what happened next, it is necessary to understand the men who ruled the skies over Burma in 1943. The air war in Southeast Asia was not fought with the same caution seen in Europe. It was faster, closer, and often more personal. Engagements happened at lower altitudes, over terrain that offered no margin for error. Pilots were expected to finish the job completely. Japanese air doctrine in the early years of the war emphasized aggression, initiative, and absolute confidence in the aircraft. The Mitsubishi A6M0 embodied that philosophy. It was not merely a fighter, it was a statement: lightweight, exceptionally maneuverable, and capable of turning inside almost any Allied aircraft. The Zero rewarded pilots who trusted it completely. By 1943, however, the war had begun to change. Allied pilots were adapting. Losses were mounting. Japanese units were under pressure to maintain control of key air corridors, especially in the China-Burma-India theater, where supply lines were fragile and long-range bombers posed a growing threat. One of the units tasked with this responsibility was the 64th Sentai, an elite fighter group with extensive combat experience. Its pilots were not novices. They were veterans trained not only to fight aircraft but to dominate airspace. Among them was Lieutenant Shigeyoshi Kuro. Kuro's records portray a disciplined, capable pilot, not reckless, but confident. Confidence in the Zero was a dangerous thing. The aircraft responded so cleanly, so predictably, that it encouraged pilots to push boundaries. Close passes, low-speed approaches, moments where caution gave way to control. From Kuro's perspective, the engagement that morning was already over. The bombers were destroyed or retreating. The threat had been neutralized. What remained was a solitary parachutist drifting downward, powerless and alone. In Japanese military culture at the time, the concept of leaving an enemy combatant alive behind friendly lines was unacceptable. Captured airmen could return to combat. They could provide intelligence. They represented unfinished business. The Skyhunter did not leave wounded prey behind. Kuro turned back. Witness reconstructions suggest he reduced speed deliberately, positioning the Zero slightly below and behind the descending parachute. This was not a firing pass. It was an inspection, a confirmation. Baggett's stillness would have reinforced the illusion. From the cockpit, the American appeared lifeless, another casualty of altitude, fire, or panic. There was no visible movement, no attempt to evade. The Zero closed in further. Standard procedure would have been to fire from a safe distance, but Kuro did not. Perhaps he wanted certainty. Perhaps he wanted to see the result. Or perhaps the silence of the moment gave him a false sense of security. The aircraft slowed to near stall speed. At that distance, the Zero was no longer a machine of war. It was glass, aluminum, and a human being inside a fragile shell. The hunter had become curious. Below, the jungle waited. Above, the sky held its breath. And between them, a man pretending to be dead counted the seconds. The distance between the falling American and the approaching Zero collapsed faster than instinct could measure. What had once been an aircraft in the distance was now a presence. Close enough to reveal details, close enough to remove abstraction from the moment. At low speed, the Mitsubishi A6M was stable but vulnerable. Its design favored maneuverability over protection. The cockpit was lightly armored. The canopy, a curved enclosure of thin glass and framing, offered visibility at the cost of safety. Against machine guns, it relied on movement. Against gravity, on lift. Against a pistol, it relied on something else entirely: disbelief. Baggett's training had never addressed this scenario. No manual described the physics of firing a handgun while suspended beneath a parachute. There were no drills, no simulations. What remained was intuition shaped by survival. The M191 weighed just over 2 pounds. Chambered in .45 ACP, it was powerful for its size. Designed for close-quarters combat, not precision at range. At altitude, in moving air, its effectiveness should have been negligible. But distance erased theory. Baggett later estimated the Zero was less than 30 feet away, close enough that the pilot's head and shoulders were visible through the canopy, close enough that the idea of aiming became irrelevant. At that range, alignment mattered more than accuracy. In one motion, Baggett broke his stillness. He raised the pistol and fired 4 shots. There was no pause between them, no adjustment, no conscious calculation. The act was reflexive, compressed into a span of seconds that barely registered as time. The recoil jerked his arm. The sound muffled by wind and altitude, each shot swallowed almost immediately by the vastness of the sky. Then the Zero reacted. The aircraft lurched violently. Its nose dipped. The wings rolled unevenly as lift collapsed on one side. There was no attempt to recover, no correction. The plane entered a steep, uncontrolled descent and vanished toward the jungle canopy below. Baggett did not watch it crash. His world had narrowed to the slow, inexorable descent of his own parachute. The threat was gone, but the danger remained. He was still drifting into enemy territory, still exposed, still alone. The sky returned to silence. From a technical perspective, the event defied expectation. Fighter aircraft were designed to absorb small-caliber impacts without catastrophic failure. Yet the Zero's vulnerability was well documented. The lack of cockpit armor meant that a direct hit could incapacitate the pilot instantly. That vulnerability had just been exploited in the most unlikely way imaginable. Baggett continued downward, unaware of whether the aircraft had crashed or merely fled. He had no confirmation, no sense of victory. Only the certainty that, for reasons he would never fully understand, he was still alive. Minutes later, Japanese ground forces captured him. The moment ended not with triumph, but with captivity. War produces an endless flood of reports. After every mission, every engagement, every loss, paperwork follows. Most of it is routine: times, coordinates, aircraft numbers, casualties. The language is precise, restrained, and designed to remove emotion from chaos. It was within this system that Owen Baggett's account quietly disappeared. After the war, once liberated from captivity, Baggett submitted his combat report like thousands of other returning airmen. The document was concise, factual, and devoid of embellishment. He described the destruction of his bomber, his parachute descent, the approaching Japanese fighter, and the 4 shots fired from his pistol. He did not dramatize the moment. He did not claim heroism. He simply stated what had happened. The response was predictable. The report was read, flagged, and categorized as unconfirmed. Not because it was proven false, but because it could not be proven true. There were no surviving witnesses, no gun camera footage, no recovered aircraft. In an era before digital records and satellite tracking, confirmation required corroboration. And this event existed entirely between 2 men who never spoke to each other. From the perspective of military bureaucracy, improbability was enough to close the file. Japanese records offered no clarity. Lieutenant Shigeyoshi Kuro was listed as killed in action. The cause of loss was unspecified. His aircraft had not been destroyed by anti-aircraft fire. There were no reports of enemy fighters in the immediate vicinity. The only unusual detail was a fatal head wound, noted without explanation. On its own, the detail meant nothing. Together, the records formed an uncomfortable shape. Baggett did not pursue recognition. He did not challenge the classification of his report. Like many veterans, he understood the limits of proof in wartime. Extraordinary claims invited scrutiny, skepticism, and often resentment. Silence was easier. For decades, the story existed only in private conversations. Among fellow veterans, it was accepted without question. Those who had flown knew how quickly chaos erased logic in the air. Among historians, it remained a footnote, a curiosity too strange to anchor conclusions. The passage of time did not erase the record. It buried it. As archives expanded and historians began cross-referencing Allied and Japanese loss reports in the late 20th century, patterns emerged. Not miracles, inconsistencies that demanded explanation. One such inconsistency lay in the skies over Burma. History rarely corrects itself loudly. More often, it does so in archives, footnotes, and marginal revisions that never reach the public eye. The story of Owen Baggett followed that pattern. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, a new generation of military historians began revisiting under-examined theaters of the Second World War. The China-Burma-India theater, long overshadowed by Europe and the Central Pacific, became an area of renewed interest. Declassified records, translated Japanese operational logs, and improved methodologies allowed for comparisons that had not been possible decades earlier. It was during this process that Lieutenant Shigeyoshi Kuro's loss report resurfaced. The details were sparse but troubling. The Zero had not been engaged in a dogfight. There was no record of anti-aircraft fire in the sector. No Allied fighters were logged in the immediate vicinity. The aircraft had entered a low-speed descent before crashing. The pilot suffered a fatal head wound caused by small-caliber ammunition. Individually, none of these details were extraordinary. Together, they defied conventional explanations. On the American side, Baggett's report, long dismissed as unconfirmable, described a scenario that matched these anomalies with unsettling precision. A Zero approaching deliberately, reduced speed, close proximity. 4 pistol shots, immediate loss of control. When flight paths were reconstructed, the geometry aligned. The estimated point of Baggett's parachute descent overlapped with the Zero's last recorded maneuver. The timing fit. There were no contradictions. What had once seemed impossible now appeared statistically unavoidable. There was no formal announcement, no medal ceremony, no revision of official doctrine. The acknowledgement came quietly, through scholarly consensus and military historical review. In specialized publications and professional circles, the incident was recognized for what it was, the only documented case of a fighter aircraft being downed by a parachuting airman using a personal firearm. When Baggett was informed later in life, his response was subdued. He did not recount the moment with pride. He did not frame it as a victory. He simply confirmed that the event had occurred exactly as he had reported decades earlier. "I just did what I had to do to stay alive." That sentence, unremarkable on its surface, carried the full weight of the war. The incident was never taught as a tactic, never cited as an example to follow, because it was not repeatable. It was not strategy, It was an intersection of circumstance, design flaws, and human instinct. And perhaps that is why it endured. The Second World War is often remembered through its largest battles and most famous names. But its true shape was defined just as much by moments like this: unseen, undocumented, and almost forgotten. Moments where survival hinged not on doctrine, but on seconds. If you want to continue exploring real stories hidden between archives, reports, and decades of silence, subscribe to the channel and follow the next episodes. Here, history isn't spectacle.